She never meant to walk into that restaurant. She never meant to sit down at that table. But on the coldest night Chicago had seen in 13 years, Maren Whitaker, 27 years old, 5 months pregnant, hunted by 2 debt collectors across half a frozen city, pushed open an unmarked wooden door and sank into the only empty chair in the quietest corner. She had no way of knowing that in all of Chicago, from judges to crime bosses, not one soul dared to sit in that chair, because that was Everett Kane's table, the man this city only spoke of in lowered voices, the man who hadn't left his black wheelchair in 6 years, and in those same 6 years, no one had dared to call it a weakness twice. When the 2 hunters pushed through the door behind her, the whole restaurant held its breath. Not because of them. Because of the sound of wheels rolling out from the back room, soft as falling snow, slow as a verdict. The man in the wheelchair stopped directly between her and the 2 men, like a steel door swinging shut, and spoke only a few words. Not loudly. Men like him have never needed to speak loudly. You're standing in my house, and this woman is sitting at my table. I'm going to count to 3, but honestly, I've never had to count past 1. The door closed behind them so fast, the nearest candle barely had time to sway. Then he turned to the snow-soaked woman clutching her worn coat, and in those gray eyes, the color of the lake before a storm, passed something no one had seen in 6 years. Not anger, curiosity. You're sitting at my table, he said. And the woman who had just crossed half a frozen city to protect the child she carried, looked up and gave the answer both of them would repeat, years later, on the most important day of their lives. Well then, could you wait until I catch my breath? That night, the wolf at the head of Chicago's pack did not send her away. He didn't know this stranger would become the only person ever to see him fall. She didn't know that tonight's mistake would, months from now, save a life out on the black ice of Lake Michigan. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the journey ahead. This is the story of how it happened. And it begins with the bitterest wind of that winter. He did not answer her at first. He simply watched her the way a man watches weather move across water, and then he lifted one hand, barely more than a turn of his fingers, and a waiter appeared at his side as if he had been standing there all along. The man in the wheelchair did not ask her what she wanted. He ordered a bowl of hot soup, fresh bread, warm butter, and a pot of tea. And when the waiter glanced toward the wine list out of habit, Everett Kane shook his head once, and the subject died quietly. Nothing for himself, just a glass of water he would not touch. Maren sat very still through all of it, her hands folded over the curve of her belly beneath the table, and she told herself she would refuse the food when it came. She had learned the price of accepting things from powerful men. But when the soup arrived, steam rising from it like something merciful, her body made the decision her pride had been arguing against. She ate slowly, carefully, the way people eat when they are trying not to show how long it has been since their last full meal, and he saw it anyway. He saw everything. That was the unsettling part. He did not stare, did not lean in, did not perform his attention the way other men did. He simply sat across from her in that quiet corner behind the frosted glass, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, and missed nothing. The worn stitching at her cuffs, the way she broke the bread into small pieces first, a habit of someone who had learned to make food last, the way her eyes went to the door every time it opened. When she was halfway through the bowl, he finally spoke. He asked how far along she was, and she told him 5 months, and he nodded, as though filing the fact away in a room with very good locks. He asked if she had somewhere warm to sleep tonight, and she said yes, which was mostly true. If a rented room above a laundry with a radiator that worked when it felt like working could be called warm, he asked, in the same level voice he had used to empty the doorway of 2 grown men, who she owed the money to. And that was where she set down her spoon. She looked at him across the candlelight, this stranger who commanded a room without raising his voice, and she said that the debt was hers, and the story was hers, and she was not in the habit of handing either one to a man she had known for the length of a bowl of soup. For a moment the corner was very quiet. Somewhere beyond the glass, silverware murmured politely against porcelain. Then something shifted at the edge of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the memory of one, and he said that most people answered his questions before he finished asking them. She said maybe he had been asking the wrong people. He studied her for a long moment after that, and she held his gaze, too tired to be frightened properly. And perhaps that was the thing that decided it, because fear was the one currency he had never run short of, and here was a woman with nothing in her pockets refusing to pay it. When the meal was done, she reached for the little cloth purse she carried, and he told her the kitchen had made a mistake tonight, and mistakes were not charged to guests. She understood exactly what he was doing, and she let him do it, not out of surrender, but because a woman 5 months along learns to choose her battles, and this one was not worth the walk home hungry. She stood, gathered her coat around her, and thanked him with the stiff, formal courtesy of someone who had been raised right and ruined by other people's promises. He slid a card across the white tablecloth then, plain, heavy paper, a name and a telephone number and nothing else. No title, no company, no crest. "If those men find you again," he said, "you call that number before you run." She looked at the card for a breath, then took it, because pride is a coat, and winter was long, and she walked out of the restaurant into the falling snow without once looking back, which he noticed, because everyone looked back. Everyone always looked back. Gideon Voss came out of the shadows near the coat room the way he always did, quiet for a big man, and stood beside the wheelchair watching the door swing shut behind her. He asked if he should handle the two collectors, and the word handle carried the flat professional weight it always carried between them. Everett turned his glass of water, a slow quarter circle on the tablecloth, his eyes still on the door. "Not yet," he said. "First find out who she is." And Gideon, who had served this man through those hard years and knew every register of his voice, heard the one that meant something had caught in the machinery of him. "Run her 3 layers deep," Everett said. "Nobody sits in that chair by accident." Everett Kane had built his life on a single article of faith, and it was this: there is no such thing as coincidence, only patterns you have not read yet. He sat by the tall windows of his penthouse that night, the city burning cold and electric 40 floors below, and he turned the evening over in his mind, the way a jeweler turns a stone under a lamp, looking for the flaw that would tell him what he was really holding. A stranger walks into his restaurant. Not any restaurant, his restaurant, the one with no sign and no listed number, the one you do not find unless someone tells you where to look. She crosses the entire dining room past a dozen empty seats and chooses his table, the one chair in the city no living soul dares to occupy. And she does it on the one night in 6 years that his doorman stepped away from his post with the latch undone. Any one of those things alone was weather. All 3 together was architecture. Somebody had built that moment, and in his world, the person who builds a moment always wants something on the other side of it. So he did not send flowers, and he did not forget her. He kept the thread in his hand and waited to see who tugged it, because if she was a piece placed on his board, then somewhere behind her was a player, and Everett Kane had made a long career out of letting the pawn come close enough to show him the hand that moved it. The first layer of digging came back within days, and it made the muscles along his jaw go tight, because the debt she carried traced upward through a chain of shell names and street corner lenders into an operation that ran its money through the North Side, and the North Side meant Cash Bellamy. Bellamy, who had spent 2 years testing the fences of Kane territory the way a coyote tests a farm at night, a lending racket bleeding into neighborhoods that had been under Kane protection since Everett's father wore the chair at the head of the table. So the loan paper became something else entirely. Buying it was not kindness, and he did not dress it up as kindness even in the privacy of his own head. It was a message written in the only language the North Side respected, a hand reaching calmly across the line and taking a thing that belonged to Bellamy's machine, then erasing it, just to prove the reach. His people acquired the paper through a lawyer 3 names removed from him, retired the debt whole, and left Bellamy's collectors holding air. If she was Bellamy's creature, the move would flush the truth out fast. That was the arithmetic. That was all it was. Then, on a gray afternoon with snow ticking against the glass, Gideon came in carrying the folder, and the folder was thick, because 3 layers deep on a human being is not a page, it is a life. He set it on the desk without a word, which was itself a word, because Gideon editorialized about everything, and his silence had exactly one meaning, which was that the contents had gotten to him. Everett read it alone. He read that Marin Whitaker had lost her mother before she was old enough to legally raise a glass, that there was no father anywhere in the record worth the ink, that she had put herself through a culinary program, washing dishes at night, and had come out of it with a pastry certificate and a plan. He read about a little storefront on a corner in a working neighborhood, a lease signed in 2 names, hers and a man named Trent Dawson, paint receipts, a second-hand oven, a small announcement in a local paper about a bakery opening in the spring. Then he read the second layer, the bank layer, and watched the whole thing come apart in columns of numbers. Accounts emptied over 4 days, Loans taken in her name with her signature, some real, some so obviously traced that the lenders themselves must have laughed. A missing person report she filed for Dawson, and then quietly withdrew when the truth arrived, that a man cannot be missing if he simply left. The storefront seized, the oven auctioned, and the third layer, the now layer, a rented room above a laundromat, a dishwashing shift at a hotel kitchen, a clinic record confirming a healthy pregnancy entering its 5th month, and a pattern of payments showing that every spare dollar this woman earned went first to interest on debts another person had chained to her name. Everett sat with the last page in front of him for a long time. The city hummed below. The snow kept ticking at the window like something patient asking to be let in. He had gone looking for the player behind the pawn, for the trap inside the accident, because his whole life had taught him that the gentle explanation is the one that kills you. And there was no player. There was no trap. There was only a woman whom every person she had ever trusted had either died on or fed on, walking through a frozen city with someone else's debts on her back and somebody new to protect under her heart. And when the hunters closed in, the only door that opened for her in all of Chicago was his. He closed the folder slowly, the way you close a door in a house where someone is sleeping. "Gideon," he said, and his voice was quiet. "When does she work next?" The letter arrived on a Tuesday, printed on the stationery of a law office she had never heard of, and it informed Maren Whitaker in 4 polite sentences that her outstanding obligations had been acquired and retired in full by a third party, that no further payments were required, and that she should consider the matter permanently closed. She read it standing in the doorway of her rented room with her coat still on, read it twice, then a third time, and felt something that was not relief at all. Relief was for gifts. This was not a gift. Gifts came with names attached, and the absence of a name told her exactly whose hand had reached into her life and swept it clean, because only one person in this city erased things that quietly, and she had eaten his soup and taken his card and walked away believing the account between them was settled. Debts had ruined her once. She knew their weight in every currency, and the debts you could not see were the heaviest kind. So the next morning she did not go to the hotel kitchen. She took 2 buses across the frozen city to the address. A quiet voice on the telephone gave her when she called the number on the card, and she rode an elevator that required a key to a floor. So high the snow fell upward past the windows, and she walked past Gideon Voss, who watched her come with the carefully blank expression of a man witnessing something that had never happened before. And she stood in front of Everett Kane in his own home and told him no. She set the letter on his desk between them like evidence. "I did not agree to this," she said. "I do not take what I cannot pay back. I trusted a man once who promised to take care of me for the rest of my life, and I have spent every day since paying for the privilege, so you will forgive me if a stranger settling my debts in the dark does not feel like rescue from where I am standing. It feels like a door closing behind me." The room was very quiet. Gideon later swore the temperature changed. Everett listened to the entire speech without moving, his gray eyes steady on her, and when she finished, he did not apologize, and he did not explain, because both would have been lies of a kind, and instead, he asked her a single question. "What did you do?" he said. "Before the world happened to you?" She told him she baked, and something in the way she said the word, flat and guarded, like a person naming someone they had loved and buried, made him look at her for a long moment before he spoke again. "Then pay it back," he said. "Not the money. The money is gone, and chasing it insults us both. I keep a kitchen upstairs that has fed no one in 6 years. Cook for this household. A fair wage, paid monthly, and a portion held against the balance until you decide the account is even. You keep your own hours around your shifts and your appointments." When she asked what the catch was, he said the catch was that he had eaten from hotel pans and restaurant boxes for 6 years, and had frankly forgotten what food tasted like when someone made it inside the walls where he lived. And that was as close to an honest confession as anyone had heard from Everett Kane in a very long time. She said she wanted it in writing. He had the papers drawn that same week, 2 pages, plain language, and this was the moment Gideon never forgot, because she sat down across the desk from the most feared man in Chicago, and she read every line of it, not skimming. Reading, her finger moving under the words, her lips pressed tight, stopping twice to ask what a clause meant, and once to request that a sentence about schedule changes be made specific, and Everett answered every question without a flicker of impatience, because he understood exactly what he was watching. He was watching a woman who had learned in the hardest school there is that a signature is a blade, and that it cuts whoever holds it least carefully. When she finally signed, she wrote her name slowly, like someone stepping onto ice, and he signed beneath her. And neither of them said anything ceremonial, because neither of them believed in ceremony anymore. She started on a Monday. She came early, while the sky was still the color of iron, and she found the kitchen exactly as he had described it, beautiful and dead, marble and steel, and not one crumb of evidence that a human being lived there. And she opened the windows of it in the only way she knew, with butter and flour and heat. When Everett wheeled himself to the table that morning, there was a plate waiting at his place. Eggs folded soft, the way a person only learns from doing it 1,000 times. Bread toasted dark at the edges, and he stopped. The man who had not eaten breakfast in 6 years, who ran an empire before most of the city was awake, sat in front of that plate without touching it for so long that Marin finally glanced over from the stove. He was not inspecting it. He was remembering something. Then he picked up the fork, and he ate all of it, every bite, in silence. And when he was done, he sat looking at the empty plate the way men look at photographs, and the only thing he said before wheeling away to his day was quiet enough that she almost missed it. "My mother used to burn the toast," he said, "on purpose. I never asked her why. The household ran on rules nobody had ever written down, and Marin learned them the way you learn where the floor creaks, by living there. The first rule was that no one spoke to Mr. Kane unless he spoke first. The second was that no one touched the telephone calls, the locked study, or any conversation that drifted up from the floor below. The third, the oldest and deepest one, was that no one, under any circumstance, mentioned the wheelchair. She broke the first rule before the end of her first week, because she was a cook and cooks ask questions. And she stood in his doorway with a wooden spoon in her hand and asked the most feared man in Chicago whether he actually liked salmon or had simply never bothered to object to it. And after a pause that made Gideon stop walking in the hallway outside, Everett said that he had been eating salmon he did not like for 6 years because a hotel chef had once decided he did. And that was the first time she heard him laugh at himself. A short, rusty sound, like a gate that had not been opened in a long time. She broke the second rule by accident on a snowy afternoon when she carried a tray toward the study, just as the door swung open on a call he was finishing. His voice in that register the household feared, flat and final, and instead of retreating the way everyone else retreated, she simply stood there until he was done and told him his coffee was getting cold, and that whoever was on the other end of that call was not worth cold coffee. Gideon, passing behind her, aged visibly. Everett took the cup. And the third rule, she did not so much break as walk straight through, on an ordinary evening that neither of them saw coming, while she was rearranging the dining room to serve at the smaller table by the windows. She stopped, looked at the space, looked at him working at his papers across the room, and asked in the same practical tone she used for asking about salmon, "Where do you want the chair placed so the transfer is easiest for you? Should I keep the left side clear, or do you come in from the right?" And Everett Kane went completely still. 3 full seconds. Marin would never understand what those 3 seconds contained, because she had asked the question the way you ask a tall man if he needs more legroom. But Everett understood, and so did Gideon, who had gone motionless in the doorway with a coat over his arm. For 6 years, every human being who entered this man's orbit had done one of 2 things. They had performed elaborate blindness, arranging their eyes to slide past the chair as though it were a trick of the light, filling their sentences with careful detours, or they had drowned him in the soft, smothering courtesy people pour on the wounded, leaping to open doors he could open, reaching for things he had not asked for, speaking to him in the gentled voices reserved for hospital rooms. Blindness or pity. Those were the only 2 languages anyone had offered him since the night his old life ended. And he had grown so fluent in enduring both that he had forgotten a third language existed. And here was a woman with flour on her sleeve asking him left side or right side, asking not whether he could, but how he preferred, the way you ask any man how he takes his coffee, and the question held no performance in it at all, only the simple engineering of a person who intended to set a table he could actually use. "From the right," he said finally. "Keep the left clear for the chair." And she said fine, and moved a seat, and went back to the kitchen, and had no idea that anything had happened. That night, long after she had gone home, Everett sat by the tall dark windows with Gideon, and told him about it. And he told it the way other men recount the closing of a deal that changed their fortunes, slowly, in detail, turning the moment over as if checking it for counterfeit. "She asked me which side," he said, "not whether I needed help, Which side? Gideon poured himself a short drink and observed that in 6 years he had watched senators, judges, and killers try to figure out how to stand in a room with this man, and a pastry cook had solved it with one sentence. Then, because the night had gone soft and honest around the edges, Gideon said the other thing, the thing he raised once a year and no more, that the doctor in Zurich had said the damage was incomplete, that the word he used was partial, that with years of brutal, patient work and a standing frame there might come a day when Everett could hold his own weight upright for a short while, a minute, maybe more, and that the door on that had never fully closed. Everett looked out at the frozen city for a long moment, the lights burning all the way to the black edge of the lake. "And to do what?" he said quietly. "Stand." "For whom?" Sitting down, "I am still taller than every man in this town." Gideon let it go, the way he let it go every year. But he noticed, as he gathered his coat, that this time Everett had waited a breath too long before answering, and that his eyes, when he said it, had drifted toward the kitchen, where the pans now hung in an order someone had chosen with care, and where, for the first time in 6 years, the room still smelled faintly, warmly, of bread. The storm came up off the lake on a night in late winter, rain instead of snow for once, hard sheets of it hammering the tall windows. And somewhere past the middle of the evening, the whole building shuddered, and the lights went out from the penthouse down to the street. Marin was still there, later than usual, waiting out the weather before her bus, and she did what she always did with uncertainty. She went to the kitchen. She found candles in a drawer that had clearly never expected to be needed, lit 4 of them along the counter, and set milk on the gas burner for hot chocolate, because the gas did not care what the power lines were doing, and that was how Everett found her. A pool of small gold light in his dark and silent home. And perhaps it was the darkness that did it, the way darkness has of making a room feel like a confessional, because he stayed. He took the cup she offered, and somewhere in that hour, with the rain walking its fingers down the glass, the 2 of them opened doors they kept locked in daylight. He went first, which surprised him more than her. He told her about his father, who had run this city's shadow country with a mind like a chess clock, and about the man who stood at his father's right hand for 30 years, a man named Ambrose Hale, who had taught Everett everything from the time he was 16, how to read a room, how to price a favor, how to know which man at a table is lying by where he puts his hands. He said Hale had been more of a father to him than his father ever found time to be, and that this was precisely the arithmetic of what happened next. Because when his father died, and the chair at the head of the table passed to a son of 28, instead of the loyal soldier of 30 years, that soldier smiled at the funeral, shook Everett's hand, and began quietly building the ambush that ended, one iced overnight that following winter, with Everett in a hospital and his old life gone from the waist down. "The bullet took my legs," he said, looking into the candle flame, "and the man who arranged it took something that weighs more. He took my ability to trust, and the doctors have no frame for standing that one back up." He said his people had torn the city apart afterward, and found only the shape of where Hale had been. Accounts emptied, houses sold through layers of paper, the man himself gone from the country like smoke off water, and that for 6 years there had been nothing, not a sighting, not a whisper, and that some nights he still caught himself setting the board against a man who no longer existed. Then he stopped talking, and Marin did not fill the silence with comfort, because she had learned at the visitation of her own mother how comfort can land like a slap, and he noticed that she did not, and was grateful in the wordless way of people who keep their gratitude in a locked drawer with everything else. Instead, after a while, she paid him back in kind. She told him about a corner storefront with big windows facing east, and how she and a man she had promised to marry spent a whole Saturday choosing the paint, and how she had wanted a color called honey gold, because morning light through it would make the whole shop look like the inside of a jar of preserves, and how Trent had laughed and agreed and kissed her forehead in the paint aisle with the swatch still in his hand. She told it plainly, the good part, and then the rest. The 4 days it took him to empty every account while telling her he was visiting his sick uncle, the signatures that were hers, and the signatures that were drawings of hers. The morning she stood on the sidewalk, watching a locksmith change the locks on her own front door, while her belly was just beginning to round beneath her coat. And then, because the candlelight made it possible, she told him the thing she had told no one. "It is a girl," she said, one hand resting on the curve of her, "and I already named her. June. My mother died in June, and for 8 years that month has been a room I walk through fast with my eyes down, and I decided my daughter is going to be born into it, and turn the lights back on. I want June to be a month I look forward to again." The rain filled the quiet that followed. Everett looked at her across the candles for a long moment. This woman folding a lifetime of loss into something a person could carry. And he said, in the voice he used for true things, that it was the best piece of strategy he had heard in years, taking the enemy's ground and building on it. She laughed, and the sound moved through the dark apartment like warmth through a cold pipe. Later, when the storm was loosening its grip and she was gathering her coat, he mentioned, in passing, the way a man mentions weather, that when the world got too loud, he still drove out, sometimes to an old fishing dock his father had kept on a quiet stretch of the lake, the one place the old man ever took his tie off, and that thinking went easier there, near the water. She said everyone should have a place like that, and pulled on her gloves, and the lights chose that moment to stutter back on, and the two of them blinked at each other in the sudden ordinary brightness like two people stepping out of a theater, both a little startled by how much of themselves they had left in the dark. It was Marin's idea, the market. She announced on a bright cold Saturday that she refused to cook another week out of deliveries chosen by strangers, that food picked by telephone tasted like it, and that if he wanted to know what his own city ate, he could come and watch her work. And to the visible astonishment of the entire household, Everett went. Gideon drove, parked where the vans park, and the most feared man in Chicago rolled down a crowded aisle of winter vegetables, between crates of squash and cider jugs, unrecognized in a plain wool coat, watching a pastry cook negotiate. And she negotiated like a woman defending a homeland. She held up a bundle of carrots and asked the farmer with a straight face whether he was selling vegetables or jewelry. She talked a man out of an extra $1 on apples by reciting what his neighbor 2 stalls down was charging. She got a bruised crate of pears for 1/3 of the asking price and told the seller he was lucky she was in a generous mood. And the seller, somehow, thanked her. Everett watched all of it from beside a pyramid of onions, and when she turned to him, holding her spoils aloft like a trophy, and declared that this was how empires were actually built, something gave way in his chest that had been braced for 6 years, and he laughed. Not the short, rusty sound from the kitchen. A real laugh, from the floor of himself, head back, shoulders loose. The laugh of the man he had been before the ice and the ambush. And Marin stood there grinning at him with pears in her arms, and neither of them saw, across the street, above a parked delivery truck, the long dark eye of a telephoto lens, watching and remembering everything it saw. The photograph crossed the city in a day. It moved the way such things move in his world. Not through newspapers, but through back rooms, from one telephone to another, printed and left folded on certain tables, slid across certain bars, and by the following evening every family that mattered from the south side to the county line had seen Everett Kane, the Wolf of Chicago, laughing in the open air beside a young pregnant woman holding pears, his face unguarded, his coat unbuttoned, his famous gray eyes soft as a civilian's. And the caption did not need to be written down because Cash Bellamy was saying it out loud, in every room that would have him, with the delight of a man who has finally found a crack in a wall he had been beating on for 2 years. "The wolf has been housebroken," he told them. "The head of the pack fetches groceries now for a pastry cook. Ask yourselves, gentlemen, whether the hand that holds this city is steady, or whether it is holding shopping bags." It was crude, and it was effective, because fear is a spell, and spells break on laughter. And Bellamy understood that no man is easier to move against than one the room has recently learned to smile about. Within the week, the tremors reached the penthouse. 2 families that had banked under Kane protection for a generation postponed their sit-downs with excuses so thin they were meant to be seen through, which was itself the message. A dock foreman on the North Side Pier tested a late payment for the first time in years, just to see what would happen. Old men who owed their positions to Everett's father began asking their middlemen careful questions about the future, and every question had the same shape underneath it, the shape of men recalculating. Gideon brought the photograph itself to the penthouse on a gray evening and set it on the desk without comment, because there was no version of the comment that helped, and he expected what he had seen every other time the world came at Everett Kane. The stillness, the cold assessment, the counterstroke already forming behind the gray eyes. That was not what he saw. Everett picked up the photograph and looked at it for a long time, longer than intelligence required, and Gideon watched him understand something at the desk that had nothing to do with Bellamy at all, because Everett was not looking at the lens angle, or the sight lines, or the parked truck he should have flagged from habit and had not. He was looking at the man in the picture, a man laughing in daylight with his coat open and his back unwatched. A man who had walked into a public square thinking about pears and paint colors and a woman's voice. A man with no perimeter left at all. For 6 years he had survived by being unreachable, and the photograph was proof, developed and printed and passed from hand to hand across his whole city, that somewhere between a bowl of soup and a candlelit blackout, unreachable had quietly ended. "They think this makes me weak," he said at last, and his voice was even. But Gideon had known him too long to miss what ran underneath it. "The trouble is," he said, setting the photograph down, "they might be right, because I look at this man, and I do not know where he keeps his guard anymore." And for the first time since the winter that took his legs, what Everett Kane felt, sitting in his tower above the frozen city, was not anger at his enemies. It was fear of his own open face. Bellamy answered the photograph the way small men answer laughter, by trying to prove he was large, and he chose the docks to do it. On a moonless night at the end of that week, 2 cars swung across the service road inside the east gate of the Kane Pier and stopped there, headlights blazing, and 6 men climbed out and stood in the light with their coats open, blocking the way of the 3 black vehicles coming through with Everett Kane in the middle one. The cold came off the lake in sheets, the containers stacked around them like a canyon of iron, and for one long moment, the only sound in the world was engines idling and water moving somewhere below the pilings. In the lead car, Everett's men reached for their door handles, and in the middle car Everett said one word into the radio, and the word was wait. Then, while 6 strangers squinted into the glare trying to look like the future, the rear window of the center vehicle slid down without hurry, and the voice that came out of it was calm enough to take the temperature of the night down another few degrees. "Daniel Reyes," it said. The 6 men went still in a way they had not been still before, because men come to work like this behind the armor of being nobody, and the voice had just reached out and taken the armor off the first of them. "Your father ran the forklift on this pier for 22 years, the voice went on, unhurried, "and when his back gave out, it was this family that paid the surgeon, and your mother still lights a candle at St. Adalbert's every winter for the man who signed that check. That man's chair is what your headlights are pointed at, son." The one called Reyes lowered his eyes to the ground and did not raise them. The voice moved on, patient as an accountant. "Tomas Aguilar, you are standing on the same dock where your brother was working the night he went into the water, and it was Kane divers who brought him up so your mother had someone to bury, and Kane money that buried him, and you sent a letter afterward, which I still have." "Wojciech," the voice said, and the big man on the left flinched at his own name. "Your daughter starts at Loyola in the fall. You are $11,000 short of the first year, and you have been borrowing at street rates from the same north side window that is paying you to stand here tonight, which means the man you work for is charging you interest on the money he is paying you. And I want you to take a moment with the mathematics of that." Nobody moved. The headlights kept burning, but they had stopped meaning anything, because light is only power when the men behind it are unknown, and one by one the voice in the dark car was turning 6 soldiers back into 6 sons, 6 fathers, 6 ledgers of debt and grief and candle smoke, all of it known, all of it held, all of it spoken in the tone of a man reading from a book he had written himself. It went down the line without mercy and without a single threat. Kowalski, whose union card had been quietly protected through 2 purges he never knew about, Diaz, whose cousin drove a Kane truck and had vouched for him at a christening, Morin, whose bar bill and whose temper and whose sick wife were all named gently, like items in inventory, and when the voice had finished, there was nothing left standing in the service road but 6 men who had come to send a message, and had instead been read their own lives by the man they came to frighten. Then Everett gave them the choice, and he gave it once. "Every man here works for a wage," he said. "I do not fault a man for that. So here is tonight's wage. The ones who walk to the gate right now and get in my foreman's truck will have honest work on this pier at honest pay starting Monday. And what happened here never happened. The ones who drive back to the north side can tell the man who sent you exactly what you saw, which was nothing, because nothing is what he has. You will not be asked twice, and there is no third road." The silence stretched long enough for the lake to slap the pilings twice. Then Reyes walked, eyes still down, and Wojciech followed him, and Aguilar, and after a moment that visibly cost him something, Kowalski went too. 4 men crossing the lit ground between the headlights and the gate, like men wading a cold river. And only 2 remained, the ones with nothing on the pier to remember. And they got into one car and left the other where it stood, because its driver had just changed employers. When the taillights were gone, Everett spoke through the open window one last time to the 4 men standing by the foreman's truck, with their breath clouding in the cold. And his voice did not rise at all, which was the frightening thing about it. "Understand what you did tonight," he said, "and understand it completely. You will be paid fairly and treated fairly, and no man will ever hold this evening over you. But if any of you turns his coat again, what you lose will not be the job. It will be the name. I will make this city forget you were ever in it. Your landlords will not know you. The parish rolls will not carry you. The union book will lose your page, and men will look through you on the street where you were born." Then he raised the window, and the convoy rolled on through the gate, and somewhere across the city Cash Bellamy waited all night for the sound of his message landing, and heard instead, toward morning, that 4 of the 6 pieces he had pushed across the board were now wearing another man's colors, and that they had been taken from him with words alone, on his own move, without one shot fired in the dark. The coat had been bothering him for weeks. Marin wore it every day, the wool one with the frayed cuffs, and since the night she had first walked into his restaurant, there had been a torn seam at the left shoulder, where the lining sagged loose, and she kept wearing it anyway, the way people wear things they cannot afford to fix, and cannot bear to replace. And Everett, who noticed everything and said almost nothing, finally acted the only way he knew how, quietly, and without permission. On a morning when she left it on the hook by the kitchen door and rode down to the market, he had Gideon carry it to a tailor's shop he had trusted for 30 years, a narrow storefront under the elevated tracks, where an old craftsman worked alone, amid steam and chalk dust, with instructions that were very simple. Repair the shoulder, strengthen the lining, change nothing that shows, and have it back on its hook before afternoon. It should have been a small errand. It became something else, because when the old tailor opened the lining at the shoulder to get at the torn seam, something slid down inside the fabric and rested against his fingers, a piece of paper folded in quarters, soft at the creases the way paper gets when it has been folded a long time. And being a man who had spent his life inside other people's garments and understood that coats keep secrets, he did not read it. He pressed it flat between 2 clean cloths, finished the seam around it the way it had originally been sewn, hesitated, and then, because his conscience would not let him sew a mystery back into the dark, he placed it in an envelope, pinned the envelope to the collar, and sent the coat home with a note in his careful old handwriting that said only, "This was inside the lining. It belongs to the lady." The coat was back on its hook when Marin returned. She noticed the shoulder first, the seam sitting straight for the first time in months, and she stood there with her hand on the wool putting it together. And Everett, watching from the doorway, was already assembling the sentence about liberties taken when she found the envelope. She read the tailor's note. She unpinned the envelope, and Everett watched her unfold the piece of paper inside and watched all the color leave her face at once, the way light leaves a window. She knew the handwriting before she understood the words. It was her mother's, but thinned, the letters leaning and uncertain, written by a hand that was running out of strength and knew it, and it was a recipe, or most of one. Brown sugar, cinnamon, cream, the amounts wandering, a line about watching the oven because the oven lies, and then the ingredients simply stopped partway down the page, as if the writer had set the pen down to rest, and beneath the unfinished list, pressed harder, as if the last of everything had been saved for it, one sentence. "For my daughter, the only thing I ever baked without a recipe." Marin made a sound that was not quite a word. Her legs took her one step back until the counter caught her, and she stood in the middle of the warm, bright kitchen she had brought back to life, holding the page in both hands, and she wept. Not gently, not the way people cry in company. She wept the way you weep for 8 years at once, for a mother gone before her time, for a girl who had worn that coat through every winter since without knowing it was carrying a letter, for the sheer blind nearness of it, that she had almost lost the coat a dozen times, pawned it once and bought it back, slept in it, run from debt collectors through frozen streets in it, and all that time, an inch from her heart, her mother had been waiting to speak. And Everett Kane, who had faced down 6 armed men that same week, with nothing but a lowered window, discovered that he had no move at all. There is no leverage against grief. There is no strategy for a crying woman holding her mother's handwriting. Every skill he owned was useless in that kitchen, and so he did the only thing that was left when everything clever had been stripped away. He crossed the room, set the brake on the chair beside her, and held out his hand. Not a gesture, not a performance, just an open hand, steady, asking nothing. And Maren looked at it through the blur, and took it, and gripped it hard enough to hurt. And he let her. And the two of them stayed like that for a long time, while the afternoon moved across the windows, her standing, him sitting, one hand holding one hand, and not a single word spent between them, because some rooms are better without them. That night she did not go home. She tied on her apron, propped the soft worn page against the sugar jar where she could see it, and she baked her mother's unfinished recipe, guessing at the missing lines the way a musician finishes a melody her teacher only hummed, filling the gaps with everything her own hands had learned. And near midnight, she set the result on the small table by the windows, 2 plates, 2 forks, and cut it still warm. They ate without speaking. The city glittered cold below them, and the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and browned sugar. And Everett ate slowly, deliberately, like a man at a ceremony, because he understood that he was one of 2 witnesses at something sacred, a conversation between a mother and a daughter, 8 years delayed, finally arriving at its table. When his plate was empty, he looked at it for a moment, and then he said, quietly, that it needed nothing. And Maren, wiping her eyes with the heel of her hand, laughed and cried at the same time and said, that was impossible. Everything needed something. And he said not this, and meant it, and she believed him. And above the sugar jar, the thin, slanting handwriting rested in the warm light. Finished at last. The invitation arrived on paper so heavy it did not bend, hand-delivered to the penthouse kitchen by a driver in gray livery, and it requested the pleasure of Miss Whittaker's company for afternoon tea at the Kane residence in Lake Forest. And it was signed Rosalind Kane. And when Maren showed it to no one and went alone, that was her first mistake, though she would have made it again, because some summonses a woman answers on her own feet. The house was old money made visible, stone and slate and gardens sleeping under burlap for the winter, and the woman waiting in the conservatory among the orchids was in her 60s, and beautiful the way a portrait is beautiful, silver hair pinned without one strand loose, pearls the size of winter cherries, and eyes that were her son's eyes exactly, gray as lake water, only cooler and older, and infinitely more patient. She rose when Maren entered, which Maren had not expected, and took both her hands, which Maren had not expected either, and said how glad she was, how very glad. And the terrifying thing, Maren understood within a minute, was that none of it was mockery. Rosalind Kane poured the tea herself. She asked about the pregnancy with what sounded like real warmth, recommended her own doctor, remembered without being told that Maren had trained in pastry, and spoke knowledgeably about a bakery in Vienna she had loved as a young bride. She was gracious, attentive, funny in a dry, quiet way, and Maren sat in that glass room full of flowers, feeling the ground being prepared under her the way you feel weather change, because kindness from a stranger this powerful is never a gift, it is an opening statement. And in time, when the cups were refilled and the light was going amber through the glass, Rosalind set down her saucer, folded her hands, and made it. You seem to me, she said, a serious person, and I find I cannot insult a serious person with small talk, so I will speak to you as one woman who loves my son to another woman who, I suspect, is beginning to. Maren said nothing, which Rosalind received as the answer it was. I buried my husband, Rosalind said, after 31 years of marriage to this life, and I have sat in hospital corridors twice for my son, once when he was born and once when they told me he would not walk again, and I will tell you what those corridors taught me. The enemies of my son have never aimed at him. They aim at what he treasures. That has always been the mathematics of his world, and it will not change because his heart does. Then she drew from the folder beside her chair a single slip of paper and laid it on the tea table, turned so Maren could read it, and it was a check, drawn on a private bank, made out in her name, and the number on it had 7 figures in it, and Rosalind's voice never lost its warmth as she said that this was not a bribe and not an insult, that it was a door, a house in another city, a bakery with her name over the glass, tuition someday for the child, a whole safe life purchased in one signature, and that all it asked in return was distance. Ask yourself the only question that matters, Rosalind said gently, leaning forward, and her gray eyes were not unkind, which made it worse. What world do you want your child to grow up in? Mine has been a world of drivers who double as guards and windows that do not open, and telephone calls at strange hours that stop a mother's heart. And I chose it, knowingly, for love. And I am not sorry, but I was not carrying a daughter when I chose. You are. The conservatory was very quiet. Somewhere among the orchids a heating pipe ticked. Marin looked at the check for a long moment, and then she stood and smoothed her head over the curve of her belly and said, "Thank you for the tea, Mrs. Kane. And I mean that. It was the finest tea of my life. But I do not sign things anymore for people who have already decided what my signature means." And she walked out of the glass room with her spine straight and her chin level, and did not look at the paper again. And Rosalind Kane watched her go with an expression that was almost admiration. But a blade does not have to cut to leave its mark. The question rode home with her on the long gray road back to the city, sat beside her on the bus with its hands folded, followed her up the stairs to the rented room. What world do you want your child to grow up in? And it found, as the cleverest cruelties always find, the wound that was already there, the old conviction stitched into her since girlhood by every person who had left or been taken, that Marin Whitaker was a weight, that the people who stood near her paid for it, that her mother had worked herself gray for her, that even Trent, even that coward, had needed to escape something, and the something had been her. And now the photograph, the postponed meetings, the whole city recalculating around Everett because of a laugh in a market, because of her. She did not cry. That frightened her later, how dry and orderly it all was. She simply came in from her shift, 2 evenings after the tea, when the penthouse was dark and Everett was still down at the pier offices, and she took her canvas suitcase from under the bed in the rented room and began to fold her clothes into it, item by item, without a note planned, without a goodbye rehearsed, because goodbyes could be argued with, and she could not afford to be argued with. Only the bus schedule to St. Louis open on the mattress, and the milk crate of June's little things, the 2 knitted hats, the yellow blanket, packed first, at the bottom, where the weight of everything else would keep them safe. He knew within 2 days, because Everett Kane had spent his whole life reading rooms, and now the room he read best was a kitchen. The signs were small, and he collected them the way he collected everything, silently, in order. The batch cooking, first, soups portioned and frozen in labeled containers, sauces put up in jars, a pantry being quietly provisioned for a household that would need to feed itself, the way a careful woman leaves a place, not empty, stocked. Then the answers getting shorter, her voice still warm but the sentences trimmed, the future tense disappearing from her speech entirely. No more next week, I want to try. No more when the weather turns, we should. Only today. Only this pot, this loaf, this hour. Then the milk crate gone from the corner of the kitchen where she had kept a few of June's things to fold in slow moments. The little hats, the yellow blanket, all of it vanished between one afternoon and the next. And finally, because he was who he was, the call he did not want to make and made anyway, and the report that came back, that the lady had purchased 1 seat on the morning coach to St. Louis leaving Thursday, one way. He did not confront her. He did not send Gideon. He did not lock a single door, because he had learned at the coldest price a man can pay that the things you cage leave you anyway. They just leave you differently. Instead, on the Wednesday night, when she came up to leave her spare apron folded on the counter, thanking him at the pier offices, she found the kitchen dark, except for the small lamp over the table by the windows, and Everett sitting in its circle of light with 2 cups of tea already poured, one at his place, one at the empty chair, the chair positioned to be easy to reach from the right, the way she had arranged this table for him months ago. "Sit with me," he said. "It is only tea. It has no conditions in it." She stood in the doorway a long moment with her coat still buttoned, and then she sat, because there are voices it is impossible to walk out on, and his was quiet in a way she had never heard it, stripped of the register that ran cities, down to the grain of the man. "I am not going to ask where you are going," he said, "or pretend I do not know there is a suitcase, or make you defend yourself. You are free. That was never in question. I only ask for 10 minutes of truth before Thursday, because I think I have earned 10 minutes, and I know you have." And Marin, who had rehearsed silence all week because silence could not be cross-examined, felt the whole architecture of her leaving crack down the middle, and she told him, not about the tea in Lake Forest, not yet, but the truth under the truth, the one that had been waiting since long before Rosalind ever poured a cup, that every person who had ever stood close to her had paid a price for the ground they stood on, that her mother had worked double shifts into an early grave for her, That the one man she chose had needed to flee so badly, he stole the walls of her life on his way out. That she had watched, these past weeks, a whole city recalculate around the man across this table. Meetings postponed, loyalties wobbling, a photograph passed from hand to hand like evidence, and all of it, traced back through the crowd at a winter market to a woman laughing over pears. "I am not leaving because I want to," she said, and her voice finally broke its banks. "I am leaving because I have done the arithmetic my whole life, and it always comes out the same. The people who keep me pay for me, and you have already paid for so much, and you do not even see the bill yet, and I cannot stand in your kitchen growing bigger every week while your world gets smaller because of me." There was a silence then, long enough for the tea to stop steaming, and when Everett spoke, he did not raise his voice, and what he said landed in her like a stone dropped down a well she had thought was bottomless. "This entire city backs away from me because it is afraid," he said. "Every room I enter goes quiet. Every hand I shake counts its fingers after. For 6 years I have watched human beings calculate the distance between themselves and this chair, and I told myself it was power, and some mornings I even believed it. And now you," he said, and his gray eyes did not let her go. "You are about to be the first person in 6 years to back away from me out of kindness, out of mercy, and I find I cannot tell you which one leaves a man more alone, the city that fears me or the woman who spares me. I honestly cannot tell you. Do not spare me, Marin. I have been spared by experts. It is just leaving, wearing a coat." She sat very still, both hands around the cooling cup, and something in his words had reached the exact room inside her where the arithmetic lived. Because he had not argued the numbers, he had shown her his own. 6 years of a man so certain he was a fortress that he never noticed he was also the prisoner in it, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that they were the same ruin built by different storms, she fleeing so no one would pay for her, he walling up so no one could leave him, and neither of them had ever once said out loud the word that was sitting in the middle of the table between the two cups, and neither of them said it now. What she said instead, after a long time, was that the tea was getting cold, and what he said was that there was more in the pot, and when she rose, it was not toward the door, but toward the stove. And that night, in the rented room above the laundromat, Marin opened the canvas suitcase and hung her clothes back in the narrow closet, item by item. Slowly, the way you rebuild a bridge you are not yet sure will hold, and she left the suitcase itself standing upright by the wall, empty but not put away, and the ticket to St. Louis stayed where it was, folded flat in the lining pocket of the worn wool coat, in the same quiet dark that had kept her mother's letter, waiting to be needed or forgotten, whichever the winter decided. Cowards have a sense of smell that honest men never develop, and somewhere across 3 states, in whatever furnished room he had drifted into that season, Trent Dawson caught the scent of money on the wind. The photograph had traveled further than Bellamy's back rooms by then, the way such things always travel, and one version of it reached a man who recognized the pregnant woman in it instantly, and did the only arithmetic he had ever been good at. The woman he had robbed and abandoned was now standing beside the wealthiest shadow in Chicago, which meant the child he had run from was no longer a debt. It was a lottery ticket, and Trent came back for it the way he did everything, through a lawyer's letter written on borrowed money, full of words like paternal rights and custody interest and amicable resolution, each one polished, and each one meaning the same thing: price me. Marin read the letter standing at the kitchen counter, and had to put it down twice before finishing it, and Everett, watching the paper tremble, took it from her gently, read it once, and told her that she would never see this man, that she would not spend one night of her pregnancy in a courtroom, and that he was going to have a single conversation. And she looked at him for a long moment and asked what kind of conversation, and he said the honest kind, which in his voice was not entirely reassuring, but she had learned by now what his word was worth, and she gave the smallest nod, and that was all the permission the matter required. The meeting happened 4 days later in a lawyer's borrowed conference room downtown, neutral ground with paneled walls and coffee and white china, and Trent Dawson came in wearing confidence and a suit one size too ambitious, ready to negotiate, and stopped short when he saw who was waiting at the table, because the photograph had shown him a man in a wheelchair and had somehow failed entirely to convey what it felt like to be in a room with him. Everett did not rise, did not offer a hand, did not introduce himself, because men who need introductions have less money than Trent had hoped. He simply gestured at the chair across the table, waited while Trent sat, and slid 2 things across the polished wood. The first was a leather folder. The second was a pen. "Open it," Everett said, and Trent opened it, and the confidence drained out of his face page by page, because the folder held his life's true resume, assembled in 11 days by people who did this professionally, the forged signatures from the bakery loans with handwriting analysis attached, the accounts he had emptied, traced deposit by deposit into his name in another state, the 2 other women in the folder's second half, one in Ohio and one in Tennessee, each with her own emptied accounts and her own copied signatures, the false references, the borrowed identities, the small mail frauds that had paid for his moving between them, all of it documented, dated, notarized, ready. Everett let him reach the last page before speaking. "Here is the shape of your afternoon," he said, in the tone a man uses for scheduling. Beside the folder is a document surrendering all parental claim, prepared by her attorney, reviewed, clean. Beside it is a pen. In my coat is a coach ticket leaving tonight, one way, and an envelope with enough traveling money to be called fare. You will sign, take the ticket, and be gone from this state before it is dark, or you will decline. And this folder goes to the people whose job it is to read it, in 3 states, simultaneously, with my attorneys volunteering as correspondents. He lifted his cup, tasted his coffee, set it down. "You have until this cup is cold," he said, "and I drink slowly." The room was very quiet. Trent looked once toward the window, once toward the lawyer's door, the instinctive triangulation of a man measuring exits, and found the only exit was the pen, and he took it. And Marin's lifetime of stolen ground came down to 90 seconds of scratching in a paneled room, his hand shaking so hard on the second signature that he had to steady it with the first, and when it was done he could not look at anyone, which was the single decent thing he did that day. But cowardice is a habit of the hands, and while the attorney was gathering the signed pages into order, Trent's eyes, doing their small rat-like inventory of the table, passed across the supporting documents clipped behind the surrender form, the procedural attachments no one thinks about, identification copies, the notary sheet, and among them, a single administrative letter confirming the pregnancy for the court record, ordinary paperwork, and on its letterhead, the name and address of the clinic where her appointments were kept. He looked away at once. He memorized it anyway. That was the whole of his talent, knowing what could be sold. And 2 hours later, with the ticket in his pocket and the traveling money folded against his chest, standing in the wind outside the coach terminal, Trent Dawson made one telephone call to a number that a man in a bar had given him the year everything fell apart, a North Side number, the kind that buys inconvenient information, and he sold them 1 sentence, 1 single line, the name of the clinic where her appointments were, and he did it for less than the envelope in his coat already held, which tells you everything about the animal. And then he boarded his coach and left the story forever. A man who in one afternoon had signed away his daughter with his right hand and sold her mother's whereabouts with his left, and slept soundly that night somewhere west of the state line, because the one mercy God grants such men is that they never understand what they are. The sale of information makes a sound, if you have built the right ears. And Everett Kane had spent 6 years building nothing else. The Northside number that bought Trent's sentence belonged to a broker whose secretary belonged, without the broker's knowledge, to Gideon, and so the whisper completed its circle in under a day, rising from a bar telephone to a buyer's ledger to a quiet gray report on Everett's desk. And Gideon did what protocol and decency both demanded. He told Marin the truth before nightfall. He sat her down in the kitchen with coffee she did not touch, and said plainly that a piece of her private schedule, the name of the clinic where her appointments were kept, had been offered for sale on the North Side and purchased, that no one had come near her, and no one would, that the clinic itself had already been quietly changed, the records moved, a new location arranged under a name that led nowhere, that from this morning a car of his choosing would take her to every appointment by a route of his choosing, and that she was, by every professional measure he trusted, safe. He said it all in his flattest, most reassuring baritone, and it did not matter, because Marin had stopped hearing him at the word purchased. Safe was a word. What she felt was older than words, the cold hand of it closing around the old wound, because strangers in another part of the city had traded money for a line of text about her unborn daughter's calendar, and every mile she had ever fled, every deadbolt, every alias on a mailbox, collapsed into the same understanding that had been stalking her since the conservatory in Lake Forest. That gravity around this man bent even the things he loved into the paths of the things that hunted him. She thanked Gideon in a voice that came from very far away. And she went home early, and the canvas suitcase standing empty by the wall of the rented room seemed, that night, less like furniture and more like a question repeating itself. But upstairs in the penthouse, a different understanding was assembling itself, and it was worse. Everett had the whole board brought to him that evening, everything from the past season laid out on the long table in the study, and he wheeled slowly down the length of it in the lamplight, like a general touring a battlefield after the smoke, looking not at what Bellamy had done but at how, because the how had been nagging at him for weeks, a splinter under the skin of his thinking. Cash Bellamy was a blunt man. Everett had watched him for 2 years, and the watching had a verdict: ambitious, greedy, brave enough, and blunt. A man who sent 6 bodies to stand in headlights, a man whose idea of pressure was volume. But look at the last season again. The photograph, not printed in any paper, never public, circulated instead through the private rooms where reputations are actually banked, aimed not at Everett's business but at his mystique, at the exact load-bearing wall of fear that held the rest. The 2 client families peeled away not with threats but with patient whispers about the future. Each approached through the one advisor they trusted most, which meant someone had mapped their trust before spending a word on it. The pier foreman tested his late payment in the same week the families wavered. 3 pressures timed like fingers closing, not thrown like stones. And now this, the purchase of a private schedule, not to use, nothing had been done with it, but simply to hold. The way a chess player takes a square he may never need, because the taking itself reshapes the board. Everett stopped at the end of the table and sat very still, and the study grew cold around him, or he did, because he was 16 years old again in a room above a butcher shop, being taught. Never send strength against strength. The lesson had gone. Send doubt. Reputation is a wall, so do not batter it, dampen it, and let it rot. Map the counselor before you court the king, and take 1 square early, quietly, that touches the thing your opponent loves, not to strike it. Only so he knows you can. Because a man who is protecting something precious does not think clearly, and a man who does not think clearly is already yours. Every move of Bellamy's season was on that syllabus, in order, executed with a patience Bellamy did not own. And Everett heard his own voice say it aloud to the empty study. Quietly, the way you say a thing to test whether the world will allow it to be true. This wolf did not teach himself to hunt like this, he said. Someone taught him. And the someone who teaches this way of hunting, he said, also taught me. Gideon, summoned, found him still at the table, and later swore that in 20 years he had seen Everett Kane angry, wounded, cornered, and betrayed, and had never once before seen him gray. Pull the Bellamy financials again, Everett said, the offshore layers, and look for money that moves like an old man thinks, and by the smallest hours of the morning they had it, a lending trust. 3 jurisdictions deep, whose capital had entered the country 18 months ago, through channels no street operator could have built. Arriving the same season, Bellamy's ambitions had suddenly grown teeth and patience at once, and the trust's architecture, its cutouts, its habits, its fingerprints, belonged to a hand that 6 years of silence had promised was gone from the earth. Ambrose Hale was alive. Ambrose Hale had come home, and Cash Bellamy, who thought he was a rising king, was a glove, and the hand inside the glove belonged to the man whose one long-ago decision had put Everett in this chair, a fact Everett permitted himself to state in his mind exactly once, without images, like reading a line from a closed file. And then he set it aside, because the man who had taught him strategy had also, without meaning to, taught him this, that the student who feels nothing at the board is the one who cannot be beaten, and Everett sat alone in the lamplight until dawn, feeling, with great precision, nothing, while below the windows the city slept on, not knowing that its old war had never ended, only wintered, and that the first move of its final season had already been played, quietly, against a bakery clinic's calendar, by a teacher come back to collect the rest of what his student owed. She learned the name on a Thursday, because she asked, and because Everett had promised her on the night of the 2 cups of tea that he would never manage her with silence, and he kept the promise even when keeping it cost him exactly what he feared it would. He told her in the study with the lamps low, told her plainly and without decoration, that the man moving Bellamy across the board was not a rival, but a ghost, the same hand that had built the winter night 6 years ago, a man who had taught him his whole art, and therefore could not be surprised by it, and that the war coming was not going to resemble anything the city had seen in her lifetime, because it would be fought between two people trained in the same school. And wars like that are not won quickly. They are survived. He told her because she had the right to the truth. He watched the truth do to her face what he knew it would do. And Maren listened all the way to the end without interrupting, her hands folded on the shelf of her belly where the baby had begun, these past weeks, to keep her own small hours. And then she went downstairs and baked through the night, because her hands needed somewhere to put what her heart could not hold. And by morning the whole penthouse smelled of cinnamon and warm sugar. And it was into that warmth, that particular cruelty of warmth, that she came to him and said his name in a voice he had never heard her use. And he turned from the window, and knew before she spoke that he was about to lose. She did not bring a suitcase. She did not stand near the door. She crossed the kitchen and stood directly in front of him, close enough that he had to look up at her. And she looked straight into his gray eyes, and did not flinch, and did not soften it, because she had decided in the night that he deserved the respect of watching her choose it. "I am leaving," she said. "Today. Gideon has a place for me. He has had it ready for weeks. I asked him not to tell you, and that was wrong of me, and I am telling you now to your face, because you have never once lied to me, and I will not go out of your life like a thief." The bread filled the silence with its sweetness. "Say the rest," Everett said quietly, "because there is a rest." And she did. "A man crossed an ocean after 6 years to finish what he started," she said, and her voice shook and held, like a bridge under weight. "He does not want your peers or your money. He wants your grief. You told me so yourself. He moves against what a man loves because a man protecting something precious cannot think. Those were the lessons. You recited them to me in that study like scripture. So look at me, Everett. Look at what I am. I am standing in the exact center of the only wound he can still give you. And I am carrying your reason to lose this war in front of me everywhere I go. And I cannot," she said. "And here the bridge broke at last. I cannot be the reason you die a second time. I watched you come back from the first one in pieces I only know from candlelight and one story. There will not be pieces after this one." And Everett Kane, who had spent the night as he had spent every night since the study, building contingencies, stacking plan upon plan, escape routes, and safe houses, and counterstrikes braided 3 deep, discovered that the one scenario he had never built was this one. A woman with flower on her wrists, standing in morning light, telling him goodbye to his face. And he had nothing. No lever, no move, no clever door. He could have said stay and meant it. He could have said the word that had been living unspoken in the middle of every table they had ever shared. And what rose up instead, from the oldest sediment of those 6 years, was the sentence the whole city had been saying behind his back since the photograph. The sentence Hale's entire strategy was built on, the one he had denied so long and so loudly, that he had never noticed the part of him that believed it, that a man who cannot stand, cannot shield anyone, that the chair that made him mythic in a boardroom made him helpless in the only war that mattered, and the belief reached up in that moment and did what beliefs do. It chose his words for him. He said, "All right," 2 words. He watched her wait, 3 seconds, 5, for the fight she had braced for, the fight some traitor part of her had prayed for. And he gave her level gray eyes in silence, because he thought he was doing the strong thing, the strategic thing, removing the piece from the board to save the piece. And only much later would he understand that what she saw across that kitchen was simply a man agreeing to let her go. She nodded once, the way you nod at the end of business. She untied the apron and folded it on the counter beside the cooling bread, and she took her mother's letter down from its place by the sugar jar, and she left. Gideon drove her north out of the city to a quiet, furnished flat above a florist in Evanston, rented under a name that touched nothing, and he carried her canvas suitcase up the stairs himself and stood in the doorway a moment. This large, silent man, looking as close to stricken as his face allowed, and said if she needed anything at all, any hour, and she thanked him and closed the door gently. And that was that. And the penthouse learned silence again, the way a body remembers an old injury. The pans hung in their careful order and went cold. The small lamp over the table by the windows stayed off. By the 3rd evening, the last of the bread smell had faded from the rooms entirely, and Everett Kane sat alone in his tower with the city glittering below him, having preserved, with flawless discipline, everything he owned except the only thing in it that had ever been alive. Hale surfaced 2 weeks later, and he did it in the old style, formally, almost courteously. through a letter carried by a neutral party to the heads of the 7 families that had kept the peace of the city for a generation, requesting a full council, the kind not convened since Everett's father died, and the letter was signed with his own name, unhidden, which was itself the opening move, because a ghost who signs his name is announcing that he no longer needs the dark. They met on neutral ground, the back hall of a shuttered banquet house on the west side. 1 long table, 7 families, their counselors behind them, Bellamy seated at Hale's right hand like a purchase on display, and Ambrose Hale himself at the foot of the table, silver-haired now, thinner than the man in the old photographs, but with the same unhurried, folded hands. And he rose and spoke to the room in the reasonable, regretful voice of a surgeon recommending an amputation. He spoke of the old days and the old disciplines, of territories fraying and tributes tested, of the photograph they had all seen and the softness it revealed. And then he came to it, the sentence he had crossed an ocean to say, delivered gently, with something that performed as sorrow, while his eyes rested on the man in the wheelchair at the head of the table. An empire, he said, needs a man who can stand on his own 2 feet. The room went very still, and Everett Kane, who had sat without expression through all of it, let the stillness ripen for a moment, and then did not answer the sentence at all, because answering it would have honored it, and instead he opened the plain folder in front of him and began, in a level voice, to read. He read numbers. He read the routing of a lending trust, 3 jurisdictions deep, and the dates its capital entered the country. And then, one by one, he read the private arrangements Hale's money had made in this very room. The marker held over the Castellano family's shipping debts, purchased quietly 11 months ago. The refinancing that had rescued the Doyle family's warehouses, at terms that converted gratitude into obligation. The trust that had bought the building where the Vasquez family banked their book, making their landlord a stranger who was not a stranger. Down the table, family by family, obligation by obligation, each one documented, each one dated, until every wavering man in that hall understood that the future being offered to them was not liberation from a weakened king, but a mortgage held by a returning one, and that Hale had not come home to free the table, he had come home already owning half its chairs. The vote that followed was not close. 5 families of 7 affirmed the existing order. The 2 that abstained did so staring at the tablecloth, and Bellamy's face during the count was the face of a man feeling, for the first time, the glove tighten around the hand inside it, because gloves are not partners. Gloves are equipment, and equipment that fails is replaced. Hale received the outcome without any visible mark, gathered his coat, thanked the table for its time with perfect courtesy, and paused only once on his way out, beside the wheelchair, to say quietly, in the voice of a teacher marking an examination, that it was well played, and that they were not finished. And Everett said, without looking up from his folder, that they had never started, and the old man smiled at that, as if at a favorite pupil's cleverness, and was gone. What happened next, no one in that world saw, and had any of them seen it, it would have frightened them more than the council itself. 2 mornings later, in a gray government building on Dearborn Street, a plain sedan delivered Everett Kane alone to a service entrance. No Gideon, no second car, no council, and he rode a secure elevator to a floor without nameplates, and was shown into a windowless room with a steel table, 2 chairs, and a recording light that was switched off. And waiting for him, there was a woman in a gray suit, with a federal identification folder, closed on the table in front of her, who looked at the most feared man in Chicago for a long moment and said only, "You understand that if you waste my time, it will go badly." And Everett said that in his entire life, he had never once wasted a woman's time. And the door was closed, and what was said behind it stayed behind it, and the story does not open that door yet. He came home that evening more silent than Gideon had ever known him. And Gideon, who had held his tongue through the council, through the departure of the only warmth the household had known, through 14 days of watching his friend calcify back into the fortress of 6 years ago, finally spent the coin of 2 decades of loyalty. He poured 2 glasses, set one down untouched in front of a man who did not drink it, and said, "I will say this once, and then never again. So hear all of it. You just beat the man who built you, in front of 7 families, without raising your voice, and I watched them remember why they fear you, and it was magnificent, and it changed nothing, because you came home tonight to a cold kitchen, and you will do it again tomorrow. You have spent 6 years proving to this entire city how strong you are, and the city believes you. Congratulations. The campaign worked. But the one person you never once showed the truth to, the tired part, the frightened part, the part that cannot plan its way out of missing her, that person packed a suitcase and walked out standing up straight because you let her believe you agreed she was a liability, when the truth is, you were terrified she would someday see you as one. Your problem was never your legs, Everett. Your problem is that somewhere in that winter 6 years ago, you decided you are only allowed to be loved when you are invincible. And Everett Kane sat with the untouched glass and the lights of his cold empire burning below. And for a long time he did not dismiss him, and he did not argue, and in the language the two of them had spoken for 20 years, that silence was the sound of a wall beginning to crack. They took Gideon on a Tuesday. Clean, professional, no marks on anyone, a car that was not his car waiting where his car should have been. And by evening a photograph arrived at the penthouse, showing him seated in a bare room, unhurt, reading a newspaper with that day's date, which was Hale's way of saying, "We are civilized men." And beneath the photograph, an address, a warehouse on the Calumet Flats, and 3 documents listed by name. The harbor rights, the gaming shares, a letter of retirement, to be read aloud to the families. "Come alone," the note said. "Bring a pen." Everett read it once. He sat for a moment with his eyes closed. Then he made one telephone call that lasted under a minute, and at full dark he drove himself south, one car, one man, through the iced-over emptiness of the industrial flats, and rolled up the loading ramp into the warehouse alone. The space was vast and cold, work lights on tripods, breath hanging in the air, men along the walls, a dozen of them, still as furniture, Gideon in a chair at the far end, jaw tight, eyes burning with the specific fury of a bodyguard made into bait. And at the center, a folding table, 3 documents, squared. A pen laid across them, level as a verdict. Ambrose Hale stood behind the table with his coat still buttoned. "You came," he said. "You taught me to keep appointments," Everett said. The wheels made the only sound in the building, slow across the concrete, until he reached the table and stopped. Hale studied him a long moment. Then he came around the table, unhurried, and lowered himself to a crouch, eye level. "The way you speak with a child or an invalid," and he looked at his student with something that had once been affection and had gone to vinegar, and he said it, softly, the sentence he had saved 6 years for. "Look what I have to take a kingdom from, a cripple's chair." The words hung in the freezing air. Nobody along the walls moved. Everett did not blink. "Sign," Hale said, rising, "and it ends gently. Your man goes home. You keep the tower and your comfort. The city forgets you the way it forgets all retired kings." Slowly, kindly, he tapped the papers once. Everett looked at Gideon. Gideon shook his head. "A fraction. Do not." Everett looked back at the table. He picked up the pen, slowly, weighed it in his fingers like a man weighing the whole of his life, and the warehouse leaned in, and Hale's face opened by 1 degree into the beginning of triumph. Then Everett set the pen down flat and looked up at his teacher, and his voice, when it came, was quiet and almost gentle. "You taught me every move I know," he said. "Openings, traps, the long game. One thing you never taught me." Silence. Hale's eyes narrowed. "Always check," Everett said, "whether your own board is wired for sound. A beat, 1 heartbeat of perfect stillness, in which an old man's face did the arithmetic and got the answer. And then the flats outside came alive. Light through every seam of the building at once, white and total. Engines and amplified voices, and the drum of boots on gravel. Federal agents flooding the ramps in vests and wind. And the men along the walls made their choices in half a second and made them badly, hands rising. And Hale stood absolutely still at his folding table in the blaze, because he alone understood the shape of it, that the ambush had been the ambush, that every word of the last 20 minutes, the demands itemized, the extortion stated, the abduction acknowledged, had traveled cleanly out of the titanium frame of the chair he had crouched beside and mocked, into a recording van a quarter-mile off, onto a federal ledger he would never argue with. And the room where he had planned to bury his student standing up had buried him instead, on tape, in his own patient voice. The woman in the gray suit came up the ramp with her identification folder open, and as the agents took the papers from the table into evidence sleeves, she paused beside the wheelchair, And to the question Hale never asked aloud, why the government would deal with such a man, she gave the only answer the story requires, spoken flatly, for the record. "Your file was worth having," she said to Everett. "His was worth more." They read Hale the words that end a free man's life, while Gideon rubbed his freed wrists and swore quietly and continuously in 2 languages, and Everett watched his teacher taken down the ramp into the white light and felt the 6-year-old winter in his spine grow 1 degree warmer. And that was all. No speech, no triumph, because the windowless room on Dearborn Street had been his move, not his confession, and moves do not celebrate. And far to the north, in a small flat above a sleeping florist, Marin Whitaker stood in a strip of kitchen at an hour with no name, sliding a tray into a rented oven because her hands would not stay still, and the radio had said only that federal activity was underway on the south side. Nothing more, no names, and she watched the little window of the oven light, and did not see it, and stirred nothing, and checked nothing. And when the smell finally reached her, she pulled out the tray, and set it on the stovetop, and looked down at the first pan of anything she had burned black in her entire life, and stood there in the dark with her hand pressed flat against the highest curve of her belly, waiting for morning to tell her who was still alive. The days that followed were victory in its purest form, which is to say, paperwork. Hale was held without release, the charges stacked like cordwood, and Bellamy's operation came apart in a week, the way a glove comes apart without a hand in it. His crews scattering to new employers, his lenders calling in their own paper, his name already fading from rooms where it had briefly mattered. The family sent envoys with congratulations and cases of wine. The pier foreman paid early. The city, in its old animal way, rearranged itself around the fact of an undisputed king, and every hour of it should have tasted like the end of 6 years of winter. And Everett Kane moved through all of it, with the flat efficiency of a man signing receipts for a shipment that no longer interested him, because each evening the elevator carried him up to the penthouse, and the doors opened, and there it was, waiting for him, the thing no enemy had ever managed to build, a home with nothing alive in it. The pans hung in their careful order, untouched. The small table by the windows sat in darkness with its 2 chairs, one placed for easy reach from the right. He had beaten the man who broke his body, avenged his father's trust, secured his empire past all argument, and he ate standing at the counter from a delivery carton, in a kitchen that still would not smell of anything, and understood, with the special clarity that arrives only after the last battle, that he had won everything he had ever fought for, and it fit inside a silence the size of 40 floors. On the 4th night a storm rode in off the plains, wind first, then snow in long horizontal ropes across the glass, and Everett sat in the dark, with an untouched glass beside him, until sitting became unbearable in a way that 6 years of discipline had no procedure for, and he did what he had done all his life. When his own head grew too loud, he went to the water. He drove himself south along the lake, through the empty white streets to the old fishing dock his father had kept, the one place the old man had ever taken his tie off, and he rolled out into the wind, because the wind at least was honest, and the lake beyond the dock was a vast black lung breathing under the snow, and for a while it worked, the cold scouring him clean, the water saying what water says. He had not come there for anything but thinking. That must be said plainly. He had come the way he had come 100 times across the years, to sit near the noise of the waves until the noise inside him lost the argument. But the dock was old wood, and the storm had glazed it, layer on layer. And when he finally turned the chair to go home, the wheels found the sheeted ice on the slight downgrade toward the outer boards, and physics, which respects no kingdom, made its one cold calculation. The chair slid. He corrected. The ice answered. The rail came at him sideways, and he caught it with one arm, as the front casters left the planking. And then there was only this, a man's grip on frozen iron. The chair tilted half off the edge, the black water breathing below him in the dark, snow driving sideways through the space where his next minutes would be decided. And Everett Kane hung there in the roaring cold and made a discovery that surprised him more than anything Hale had ever taught him. He did not want to let go. Every muscle from his hand to his ribs screamed with the holding, and some frozen ledger inside him, 6 years old, whispered that this was the tidy ending, the empire secured, the accounts settled, and against that whisper his body answered with a single word, no, and the word had a face, and the face had flour on its cheekbone and was laughing over pears. He held, and north of him, across the storm, The night had already begun to move, because Marin had heard the name Hale on the evening news at last, arrested, charged, finished, and understood in one lightning stroke that the war she had removed herself from was over, and she had telephoned Gideon with her heart in her mouth and asked him to drive her back tonight, right now, because there was a truth she should have said in that kitchen instead of goodbye. And Gideon had her at the penthouse before the hour turned, and the penthouse was dark and empty, and his car was gone from the garage, and no call was answered, and while Gideon stood in the cold kitchen working the problem like a soldier, Marin stood very still, listening to a memory, a man's voice by candlelight in a blackout, mentioning, in passing, the way a man mentions weather, an old fishing dock where thinking went easier, and she said 4 words, his father's dock, drive. They came down the lakeshore road with the storm hammering the windshield, and the headlights found the dock and found the shape at the end of it, tilted against the rail, and Gideon was out of the car before it fully stopped, testing the ice with each stride. And Marin obeyed the one law that mattered, and went no farther than the solid planking at the landward end, dropping to her knees where the boards were dry under the shelter of the boathouse wall, and when Gideon's arms hauled the chair back from the edge and dragged man and frame both up the grade to safety, it was her hands that were waiting, her hands that closed around Everett's frozen hand and would not release it, and her voice, pitched steady over the wind by pure will, that gave him the only order anyone had dared give him in 6 years. "Look at me," she said. "Not at the water. At me. You are not finished. You still owe my daughter a middle name." In the car, with the heater roaring and the storm still throwing itself against the glass, the most feared man in Chicago shook. He was soaked to the ribs and frozen through, and that accounted for some of it, but not for all of it. And he knew it, and for the first time in 6 years he did not try to stop it or disguise it, or convert it into stillness by force of will. He sat wrapped in the blanket Gideon kept in the trunk, his hand still inside both of Marin's hands, and he let her see it, the shaking, the aftermath, the animal fact of a man who had nearly gone into black water and knew it, and letting her see it cost him more than the rail had, and was worth more too. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, and he did not build the sentence carefully the way he built all his sentences. He simply let it out the way it was. "I have a plan for everything," he said. "My whole life, every threat, every loss, every ending, filed and answered before it arrives. Contingencies for my own funeral, alternate routes for wars that will never happen, and I could not plan you. I tried. I sat in that study with all the lamps burning, and I could not build a single acceptable version of losing you, because there is no fallback position from you, Marin. There is no second location, and when a man like me finds the one square on the board he cannot afford to lose, do you know what he does? He pushes it away from the fighting. He tells himself that is strategy." He watched her face in the dashboard light. "It is not strategy," he said. "It is fear, wearing my father's coat." And Marin, who had knelt on frozen planking and given orders to the wind, brought his cold hand up and held the back of it against her cheek, and made her side of the treaty in a voice that did not perform anything. "Then hear mine," she said. "All my life I have solved being loved by leaving first, because if I carry myself away, nobody has to pay for me. And I called it kindness, and it was cowardice with a suitcase. I promise you." And she pressed his hand harder against her cheek, so he could feel the words being made. "I will never again disappear to be noble. If I am frightened, you will hear the fear out loud, standing in front of you, and we will be frightened in the same room." And he answered, and it was the plainest bargain of his bargaining life, "Then I promise you this. I am done being invincible in my own kitchen. You will get the tired man, the aching man, the man who cannot always be certain, and I will trust you not to run from him." She said, "Deal." He said, "Deal." And Gideon, driving, kept his eyes courteously on the snow, and privately considered it the finest negotiation he had ever witnessed. The rest came in its own season, quietly, the way real endings do. Weeks on, in a kitchen once again warm and alive, the telephone rang while Marin was working a slab of dough with flour to her elbows, and Everett, watching her from the doorway of the study, the sleeves of his shirt rolled, took the call without stepping away. Gideon's voice was brief. "It is done," he said. "Pleaded out this morning. All counts. No trial. The old man is filed away for what remains of him, and the other one went with him." Everett said, "Thank you." and set the telephone down. And that was the entire funeral of Ambrose Hale in his student's life. 6 years of winter closed in 9 words, while through the doorway the woman at the counter turned the dough and pressed it flat, and the smell of browning butter moved through the rooms, and Everett sat a moment longer looking at her, understanding that this was how the old chapter actually ended. Not in a courtroom, not at the warehouse, but here, in the exact spot where the new one smelled like this. What came after that surprised the city more than any war. He called a table of his own, his counselors, his accountants, the gray men who kept the machinery, and he laid before them a plan that had been growing in him since a windowless room on Dearborn Street, the piers folded into a licensed logistics corporation, the gaming interests sold or brought into the light, the lending books forgiven or converted to a community fund carrying his mother's family name. Every dark room of the Kane empire either shuttered or given windows, a root of years, lawyered and patient and irreversible. And when the oldest of the counselors cleared his throat and asked, carefully, what he was to tell the families who would want to know why, Everett looked past him, through the glass, to where the evening light was coming honey-gold across the city, and gave the table one sentence to carry back. My father built this empire so that no one would ever dare look down on the name Kane, he said. My daughter is going to grow up in one where no one ever needs to be afraid of it. That is the whole of the succession plan, gentlemen. Break the parts of it that frighten people, keep the parts that feed them, and leave my little girl a name she can say out loud, anywhere, in daylight. He told her they were going for a drive on a Saturday in early spring, and he would not say where, which was so unlike him that she spent the whole ride watching his face instead of the streets, and so she did not understand until the car turned onto the old corner and stopped, and there it was, the storefront with the big windows facing east, the glass washed clean, the woodwork restored, and the whole front painted, perfectly, patiently, in honey gold, the exact shade she had chosen in a paint aisle a lifetime ago, and above the door, where a lender's notice had once been taped, hung a simple wooden sign that read Whitaker's, and Marin sat in the car with both hands over her mouth. He had bought the building through 3 quiet layers, so no one could ever trace it and inflate the price, had the ovens rebuilt, the floors relaid, and when he rolled beside her through the front door, the morning light came through that golden glass exactly the way she had once dreamed it would, like the inside of a jar of preserves, and there on the counter, in a small frame, stood her mother's letter, the thin slanting hand, the unfinished list, the one finished sentence, home at last above a working oven. I cannot give you back the years, Everett said quietly, watching her turn in the light, but I could give you back the door you once had to watch a stranger lock. That much was owed. She was still trying to find her voice when he nodded toward the counter, where a single white pastry box waited with her name on it, and inside, on a bed of baking paper, sat a ring, simple, warm gold, chosen by a man who had learned her taste the way he learned everything, completely, and she said yes before he finished asking, and the empty shop heard the first laughter of its new life. They were still standing in that light when the bell over the door sounded, and Rosalind Kane walked in unannounced, alone, no driver visible, and mother and son looked at each other across the flower-scented air for a moment, before she crossed to the counter and set down a flat, lacquered box. Inside lay 2 things. The check from the conservatory, torn cleanly in half, both halves kept, which meant she had carried them all this time, and beside the torn paper, a slender antique bracelet, worn gold, very old, my grandmother's, Rosalind said, and then her mother's, and then mine, and it goes now to the next daughter of this family, whenever she is ready for it. She touched the torn check once, lightly. I believed this could protect my son, she said. All it ever proved is that I had not yet understood him. Then she looked at Marin directly, and the gray eyes were her son's eyes at last, thawed. I hope you will let me learn, she said, and Marin, who knew better than anyone alive what it cost a proud person to stand in a doorway and ask to be let in, came around the counter and answered her with an embrace instead of a sentence. And that was the whole of the peace treaty. And it held. It was later that same golden afternoon, with the women talking paint and shelving at the front of the shop, that Everett beckoned Gideon to the back doorway and asked him the question that had been sitting in the locked drawer of his mind since the beginning. The first night, he said, my doorman does not leave his post. In 6 years he never left that door once. Yet that night, with 2 collectors hunting a woman through the snow, the latch was open and the man was gone from it. I never ordered that. Tell me who did. And Gideon was silent for a moment. This large, quiet man who had stood at more doors than anyone in the city. And then he said, "I did." Everett waited. "I had a sister," Gideon said. "Years ago, another city, another winter. She was in trouble and she ran. At night, in the snow, exactly like that. And that night, nobody opened a door for her." He looked out at the golden light on the counterglass. "So for 6 years, wherever I have kept a door, I have kept one standing order of my own that you never knew about. That if someone comes running in the snow, the door opens first and we ask questions after. It is the only order I ever gave in your name without permission." Everett looked at his oldest friend for a long time, and then he reached up and gripped his forearm once, hard, the way soldiers do. And nothing more was ever said about it, because some debts are not spoken, they are simply understood to be unpayable. They were married when the true warm weather came, on a lawn above the lake, small, bright, unarmored, no guards visible, though Gideon swore the perimeter was the finest work of his career. And when the moment came for the rings, Everett Kane set his hands on the arms of the chair, and the standing frame that months of silent, punishing, twice-weekly work had earned him locked quietly into place, and before the whole gathering he rose. Not for long. Under a minute, as the doctor in Zurich had once predicted, and it took everything he had, and everyone present could see that it took everything he had, and no one moved to help him because Marin had asked them not to. He stood, unsteady and entirely present, and he had once said that sitting down he was taller than every man in the city, and perhaps that was even true, but he had not done this to be taller than anyone. He had done it to be exactly level with her eyes when he made his vows, and he was. And when the rings were exchanged, he sat back down with the calm of a man completing any other decision, and the lawn erupted, and Gideon wept openly, and denied it for years. June came in its own time, as June does. The month Marin had walked through with her eyes down for 8 years arrived that year full of light, and in a sunlit room with the windows open to the sound of the lake, a daughter was born, healthy and loud and entirely unimpressed by dynasties, and they named her June Rose, for a grandmother who wrote letters into coat linings and a grandmother who was still learning. And in the quiet of that first golden hour, Everett Kane held his daughter by the window, this small, warm weight, who would never know the world her father had dismantled for her. And the man all of Chicago had feared for 6 years, bowed his head over her, and wept, freely, without shame, because he finally understood that this had been the treasure the whole war was over, and he had won. And perhaps that is the lesson this story leaves behind, that real strength was never the power to make a city afraid. It is the courage to let one person see you weak, and that the worth of a human being is not measured by the legs they stand on or the things life has taken from them, but by what they choose to become after everything, because a woman the world abandoned chose to become a home, and a man the world feared chose to become a father. And between them they turned the coldest night in 13 years into a month called June. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you can hear more heartfelt stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And which moment stayed with you the longest? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because we would truly love to hear what is in your heart. Thank you for listening all the way to the end, and we wish you good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days ahead. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next video.